is AM Agenda with Kieran Gilbert.
Hello and welcome to the program. This morning, straight to the United States, where the outgoing Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke has announced the Federal Reserve will start scaling back its massive stimulus from January.
The committee decided, starting next month, to modestly reduce the pace at which it is increasing the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. The committee also clarified its guidance on interest rates, emphasizing that the current near-zero range for the federal funds rate target likely will remain appropriate well past the time that the unemployment rate declines below 6.5%, especially if projected inflation continues to run below the committee's 2% longer-run goal. Today's policy actions reflect the committee's assessment that the economy is continuing to make progress, but that it also has much farther to travel before conditions can be judged normal.
Let's get some analysis this morning, and joining me, senior economist from NAB, David de Garis. David, it's good to see you. This Fed announcement, obviously the result of some promising recent signs in the US economy.
I think so, Kieran. That's one of the main takeaways for me out of this, is that we know how cautious Bernanke has been on the US economy and careful that he's expressing quite a bit more confidence about the underlying state of the US economy, the fact that they've started tapering now, even though it's a little bit later than what we might have expected 6 months ago, the fact they have started the ball rolling. And the other is that how conditional further tapering will be. In other words, there's no preset course there. It'll depend upon the economy, the unemployment rate, and we've just heard from the chairman there on the downside risks to inflation. So if those inflation numbers can continue shooting on the lower side, that'll just buy them more time to taper less quickly, I guess, through 2014.
Now, our dollar this morning has been pretty volatile, watching it in response. How do you judge, though, the impact for Australia as things settle down?
Have seen is, a start of a new wave of capital back to the US dollar, Kieran. So the expectation there that the tapering has started, that, within 1 year to 18 months' time, maybe even the federal funds rate will begin to rise. So the market's sort of moving ahead of that. So we're seeing that back towards the US dollar. We're seeing money flowing out of Japan as a result of that. So the yen has been quite weak this morning. And, of course, the Aussie dollar is sort of in that 88 to 89 cent range. So I think the fact that the Fed has started the tapering would be quite pleasing to the Reserve Bank, releasing a little bit more pressure from the Aussie dollar, and obviously a lower Aussie dollar tends to support domestic industry here, Kieran. So maybe makes the job of the Reserve Bank that much easier or less anxious going into 2014.
David de Garis, thanks for your insights this morning. Appreciate it.
Good on you, Kieran.
With me on the program now, Liberal Senator Seselja and Labor frontbencher Jim Chalmers. Jim, first of all, some encouraging news out of the US, according to David's analysis, and looking around most other commentators this morning as well here in Australia.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything that David just said. I think that this signals a bit of a return to things being slightly more normal than they have been. The Fed's program has done a great job in propping up the US economy, and that's had good flow-on effects for the global economy. But this means that things are starting to slowly edge towards more normal. I also think it's very good that it's such a modest taper to begin with, so that markets can get used to it. Of course, it's been flagged for some time, so the markets have been pricing things in. The other thing that David mentioned, which I think Australians would be most interested in, is that most analysts do expect that this will mean a strengthening of the US dollar, which means that our own dollar is expected to depreciate over time, and that's probably a good thing for a lot of our industries as well.
Well, given it's Seselja been such a headache for manufacturing, for tourism, the list goes on in terms of the high dollar.
Oh, look, I agree. I agree with Jim's analysis there. I think that the dollar coming down will be a good thing for so many industries. Maybe not if you're travelling overseas, but for so many of our industries, the dollar coming down as a result of this decision is a good thing. We want to see a competitive manufacturing industry. We know that the high dollar has been a real challenge for that and for other industries, as you say, such as tourism. So these are positive signs, but it's also more positive from the fact that we want to see the US economy doing well. The world economy does better when the US economy is strong. There are some very strong signs out of the US. I think it's too early to say that they're out of the woods, but the unemployment's coming down, and the Fed's response indicates their growing confidence in the US economy as well.
Jim, let's turn our attention now to China and the Financial Review reporting some sources saying Beijing's worried about a hardening of policy under the Abbott government towards Beijing. Now, isn't it fair enough, though, for Julie Bishop to raise concerns, as she did a few weeks ago, over that unilateral action by China in setting up an air defence zone in the East China Sea?
Well, I think every Australian has an interest in our China relationship being as strong as possible. Of course, it reached a real high watermark when Julia Gillard inked the strategic partnership in April with the Chinese. That was seen as a very positive development in relations. So every Australian should be concerned with the story that we read today in the Fin about the deterioration in that relationship. Of course, from time to time, Australia will speak up in its own interest, and that's a good thing. But when it comes to foreign relations, you need an abundance of caution, you need diplomacy, you need care, you need subtlety and nuance, and I don't think even the Abbott government's biggest cheerleaders would ever accuse them of having any of those things.
This has got to be a bit of a worry, Seselja, from a number of different levels, but the timeline for the free trade agreement set by Mr Abbott, of having that done by September, that's looking a bit, isn't that looking a bit shaky now, given these concerns emanating from Beijing?
No, look, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I don't think that one story in the Fin Review should sort of suggest that things are in trouble. I think that the point that Jim made there, part of the point he made is correct, and that is that Australia should speak up in its own interests. We have a strong and robust relationship with China, as we have strong and robust relationships with many other nations, but having a good relationship with China doesn't mean distancing ourselves from our traditional allies such as the United States.
Does Mr Abbott need to go to Beijing very early on in 2014 to try and get things back on track? Because obviously they're annoyed. The Foreign Ministry made it pretty clear early on as well.
I think a Beijing visit would always be high on the agenda, so I've got no doubt that will happen pretty soon, but that's really a matter for the Prime Minister. But it is a strong relationship, it's a robust relationship, and I go back to the point, we shouldn't distance ourselves from our traditional allies such as the United States and Japan in order to have a better relationship with China. We will continue to have a very good relationship with China, but we'll also speak up in our own interests.
Well, there are those longer term alliances, aren't there? Or alliance might not be the word, but certainly ties, closer ties with Japan and Taiwan, which Julie Bishop and the Abbott government have sought to nurture since winning on September 7, Jim.
Oh, look, it's important we have a strong relationship with the US and Japan, of course, but in our region, our future really is so intricately tied up in us having good relationships with all our Asian neighbours. And I think that Julia Gillard showed in April that it's possible to have good relations with China and the US and Japan. And I think it shouldn't be beyond the current government to get beyond these sorts of concerning reports and to get all these sorts of relationships, not just with China but Indonesia and others, back on track, because every Australian has an interest in them fixing it up and getting it right.
On to the paid parental leave scheme. Tony Abbott's generous proposal, Seselja. It looks like that the Prime Minister is now open to compromise, that he concedes he might have to compromise to get it through the upper house.
Well, the Prime Minister is still very committed to his paid parental leave scheme and the Coalition's paid parental leave scheme. The reality is we don't have the numbers in the Senate, so in order to get it through there may have to be some negotiations, but this is a signature policy that Tony Abbott made very much his own and pushed forward on behalf of the Coalition.
Would that end up being a blessing in disguise in some respects, because a lot of your colleagues think it's too generous?
Well, look, there's always differing views on virtually all policies, but the reality is it is fully funded. In fact, I think it actually improves the budget bottom line overall when you look at the revenue measures associated with it. So not only does it do that, but it's also important for productivity. And, you know, this is something that the Coalition took to the election. This is something that is part of our mandate. We would expect that to be honoured. I think the differences differences between us and the Greens on this aren't significant, but I'm not going to preempt what discussions might take place.
Well, the Prime Minister, it was the Prime Minister's comments yesterday, which many are seeing as him watering down his commitment to that scheme in its totality of paying women a full replacement wage and maternity leave of up to $150,000 per annum. These were the comments from Mr Abbott yesterday.
Well, obviously it has to get through the Parliament, and that may well involve some negotiation, but I am committed to the scheme that we took to the election. And I believe that's a fair scheme, and I don't think we're in an either-or situation, a good deal for people with disabilities versus a good deal for new parents. I don't believe we're in that situation. I think if we get the economic fundamentals right, if we do the design work right, we can have an excellent national disability insurance scheme and, at last, an overdue, a fair dinkum paid parental leave scheme.
Jim Chalmers, the PM could end up having the best of both worlds, having the PPL policy that he wants, albeit more affordable.
Oh, I don't think you'd see it that way. I think you'd see it as him breaking promises left, right and centre. I mean, he went to the election saying that this was his captain's pick, this was his promise to Australian mums. We've got a better way of providing paid parental leave, but this was Tony Abbott's commitment to people, and it's a pattern of behaviour here, whether it's this, the NDIS, whether it's promising not to cut health and education, which happened on Tuesday, all kinds of things that Abbott went to the election saying, and now he's got a different view. It's just, you can't believe a word that the bloke says.
Let's move on to the industry support for Holden. Now, it looks like, well, first of all, an associated issue in the sense of industry welfare. SPC looks like it won't be getting the support that it was after. Seselja, the Prime Minister hardening his stance against that sort of subsidy.
Well, look, I think the Prime Minister has rightly pointed out that businesses need to make sure they manage themselves appropriately, and the role of government is to make sure that the conditions are as good as possible. And the conditions over the last 6 years under Labor haven't been good for business, and that's one of the reasons we see a number of businesses struggling and some businesses seeking support. Now, the coalition government will always work with industries to try and assist, to try and make sure that we keep jobs in Australia, that we keep a robust manufacturing industry in Australia. But it's not about never-ending handouts, and that approach that I think is being advocated again by the Labor Party is the wrong approach.
Well, in terms of the handouts, Jim, it's actually, even though Bill Shorten said it was woefully inadequate, it's more in dollar terms than what was offered when under Labor, Ford and Mitsubishi announced it was wrapping up. They would be wrapping up their operations here.
Oh, the Liberal government's pulled out $500 million out of the sector and tried to pretend that giving $60 million back for some studies and roundtables makes up for it all. And then you had Abbott rub salt in the wound by saying that these people would feel liberated by losing their jobs. I mean, the last fortnight, if you're Peter Costello, Tim Wilson or Sophie Mirabella, the last fortnight's been great in the job market, but if you're the Australian worker, it's been woeful. And to have Tony Abbott say, oh, we've liberated them from their jobs, I just think it's an appalling thing for a Prime Minister of Australia to say a week before Christmas.
Isn't it extraordinary that, Jim, that the Labor Party, having caused so many of these issues, having governed for the last 6 years and overseen these terrible economic conditions, is now blaming the coalition for every problem that we face? That somehow Holden is our fault. When you've been in government for the last 6 years, you put in place the FBT changes, you put in place the carbon tax, and now somehow the new government is to blame.
During a global financial crisis.
Ford left on your
and then you cut $500 million out of Holden. You goad them to leave. You've got Joe Hockey beating his chest in Parliament. And then when they leave, you pretend it's Labor's fault. It's absurd, Zed. You're better than that.
Who's been in government for the last 6 years?
You're better than that. We created 1 million jobs in Australia despite a global financial crisis, Zed.
Ford left on your watch, and now
you chased Holden out. You put $500 million out of Holden assistance. You chased them out of the country, and now you want to blame Labor. It's absurd.
Jim,
you create the mess, and then you blame us when we try and clean it up.
Okay, gents, we're going to have to wrap it up there, and my apologies. But look, while it was a robust end to the discussion, I do want to thank you both for your contributions throughout the year.
It's a pleasure, Kieran.
And
thank you.
Have a good Christmas, Jim, up there in Queensland.
Merry Christmas, Jim. Merry Christmas, Kieran.
All the best to you and your families, guys.